Welcome back to our third episode on chaplaincy and crisis intervention. I'm Brian Ginther. I am a chaplain. I'm a crisis interventionist. I'm an approved instructor for ICISF, and I am a team coordinator for our CISM team. And this is my lovely wife, Jeannie Ginther, who's also a crisis interventionist and chaplain, and also a leader on our CISM team. In the last two episodes, we've talked about what a chaplain is, and we've talked about what crisis intervention is and what crisis interventionists do. If you haven't seen those episodes, I invite you to go back and watch them. The links to them will be in the description of this podcast episode. And what we're focusing on this episode are concerns from the chaplain perspective on working with crisis intervention and concerns from the crisis intervention side on including chaplains with their team. We're going to talk a little bit more about each of those.
So one of the things that I was thinking about when we were talking about this episode was I went through school to get my degree in psychology. And as a Christian, right, I was actually had a little bit of concern about studying psychology for 4 years because that's a lot of psychology. A lot of times in the church, we may struggle with science. And when we hear about some people studying science or they say scientifically speaking, we tend to shrink back because we think, well, isn't science try to disprove God?
Yeah.
Isn't science everything that we experience in the natural world? Whereas being a Christian, we think that's more of a spiritual world. Yeah. And we separate the two. But one thing that I learned, because I went through a Christian university, and one thing that I learned right off was that psychology is not necessarily, it's not against Christianity or our spirituality or God. Psychology, if you break down the words in the Greek, it actually means very simply the study of the mind or life. So it's the study of the mind or life. Now, who created the mind and life, right? As Christians, we believe that is the God of the universe, right? So we believe. So actually, if you think about it, psychology is not opposite of Christianity. It's not opposite of our spirituality. It actually helps us learn a little bit more about the way that God created the mind and how God created us as living beings. And it helps us to kind of learn a little bit more about that. So we have to know that it's more of a science. If I had to break it down to somebody and say very simply what crisis intervention is in just complete layman terms, I would have to say it is exactly, it's science of how God created the brain to process, right? And so to me, that pairs really well with our spirituality. And then, of course, we have chaplaincy that actually helps to bring in our spirituality, and you pair them two together, and it brings balance.
So psychology is an anti-faith.
Right. It is not anti-faith. I actually, like I said, I went through a Christian university for 4 years to get my degree. And it was amazing how they taught us how to integrate psychology into our spirituality in a way that complemented it. And actually, in a lot of ways, proved our spirituality. Science proving, a lot of times people use science to prove God, to prove Christianity.
That was actually the original purpose of the science field, was to go through and understand the world as God made it.
Right.
So
absolutely.
chaplains shouldn't be afraid of crisis intervention tools as a psychological tool to helping people.
No, because we are more than just spirituality. We're more than spirit. We have a soul and we live in a body. So we can't live our lives, I believe, my opinion, in just being spiritual and not address the things that we experience in our everyday lives in the soul. And I think a lot of times as Christians, we get in trouble doing that. I know that I did. Before I learned about crisis intervention, there were many times that I thought, well, I just need to have more faith with what I'm struggling with in my soul. But the truth is I needed to address it. And you can't necessarily address it spiritually when it's something that is more physical.
It's kind of like you can't have so much faith that you never need to eat dinner.
Right.
Because at some point your body's going to be upset with that.
That's right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So yes, they do pair very well together. And but this was something that I had to overcome, and I had to make a decision that psychology, therefore the science, therefore crisis intervention, was definitely something that complemented my walk as a chaplain and in my faith, and personally and it wasn't something that was actually opposed to it.
That's amazing. I mean, so many times in Christianity or in the other faiths that I've had the privilege of helping people that believe differently than me as a chaplain, they shrink away from psychology. They shrink away from crisis intervention. And it's so good to hear that actually we can talk about that in a way that we can still help them. It's not something to shrink away from as a chaplain.
Absolutely. I do have a story that I just kind of want to briefly share. I have permission to share this story, but it pairs so well with what we're talking about. We had a crisis team, and we were working with first responders, paramedics, and EMTs. That when they would have a bad call, if they had a bad call, something that was some real bothersome to them, a death of a child or something that was a little harder to deal with, we would meet with them. And we would meet with them as our crisis team, and we would come and work with them, do crisis intervention with them, and then go from there, and then we would meet with them a second time. So on this particular event, I believe we were out of town, and someone else on our team had met with there was a death of a child. It was a pretty horrific death of a child. And one of the paramedics that was on shift was hit really hard by it. She was the one that was in charge of taking care of the child that ended up passing. It ended up dying. And so, long story short, I believe they worked with her several times. The team members had met with her, did crisis intervention with her. And she was very, very intelligent and was actually very receptive to crisis intervention. And but whenever we got back from out of town, I believe we were gone for that first week, they asked me to meet with her because she was still struggling. And so I met with her, and it felt like we weren't really getting anywhere. I worked with her again. We went through, the steps of crisis intervention again, and actually to see what was going on. I ended up referring her out to a professional counselor. Yeah. She ended up, who was also specialized in trauma, and who was also crisis intervention trained. And I sent her out because she just wasn't getting any better. Yeah. She wasn't getting any better. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't eating very well. She wasn't able to get back on an ambulance. She was terrified. She kept having nightmares. It was just a whole lot. It was definitely leaning into PTSD. She was really struggling. I believe it was coming on usually about the 30-day mark, and she just wasn't getting better. She said she had gotten a tad better, but not too much better. So anyway, as she was going through these things, I had met with her many times, as well as other people. And then she knew I was a chaplain. And so I asked her, I said, what do you think will help you? And she said, well, I really don't know. And I asked her, I said, well, you know that I'm a chaplain. And so you know that I walk in faith in God. And so where are you? Where is your faith walk? Is there something that you actually believe in or not believe in? Because we were desperate at this point. I really wanted to see this girl get better. She was young, just starting her career. And she said, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. And I said, do you mind if we talk about that? Because, we've done crisis intervention, we've done the counselor, we've done all these things, and she's just not getting any better. And so she said, absolutely. And that was at the time that I brought you in, and I asked her permission because you'd been a paramedic a lot longer than I had. And so I asked her if we could meet, and we ended up talking with her and praying with her, and it came out that she was dealing with a lot of guilt.
About
right?
Things that weren't even about the call that she was on.
Yeah, and it came out because we approached it from a chaplain aspect, a spiritual aspect, that we were able to help her to be able to process out this guilt. And she was able to, we prayed with her, and I mean, it was almost like a switch had been flipped, and immediately, and it'd probably been 6 weeks at this point, and she all of a sudden was like somebody turned on the lights, and it was like everything that had been done to that point all of a sudden shifted into place. And I think I had contacted her by phone a few times after that in text. But she said, yeah, I'm better. She said, I was stuck. That was the place where I was stuck. And that story so impacted me. And I tell that story with her permission when I talk about crisis intervention, because it shows so well how we paired crisis intervention, the tools of crisis intervention, but in the end, she needed chaplaincy. And I believe one wouldn't have worked without the other.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to have that conversation on
No.
day one with her. Crisis intervention
Yes.
set the stage
Absolutely.
for what ended up helping her. And it didn't just help her return to her career. Her main concern was going back on an ambulance that she might run across another child.
Yes.
And she couldn't stand another child to die. What's amazing about her story is a year or a couple of years later down the road, her job was in a children's hospital, a large trauma hospital, working in the ER, and her job was to hold the hands of children that were either dying or whose family members were dying. What a turnaround in her story.
That is a miracle story, and I wish they were all that amazing. Right. But I'm going to tell you, this is why chaplaincy and crisis intervention pair so well together. Because if, as a crisis interventionist, like you said, I brought in the tools that she needed to be able to start the process. And we used a counselor. Yeah. And the counselor was able to help fill in a gap there as well. But then it took us stepping into that place as a chaplain where I could say, okay, we've gone this route. Now let's go this route. And she was like, yeah, this is what I need. Yeah. And didn't even realize where she was stuck until we introduced our spirituality as a chaplain and helped her to be able to walk out that guilt.
And as a chaplain, you wouldn't have been able to start that process if you weren't crisis intervention trained. Every chaplain should be crisis intervention trained, because those tools are necessary to begin the process that opens the door sometimes for people to be willing to engage the spiritual care side of it. And that's the other side. Every crisis intervention team should have at least one chaplain on the team. ICISF will tell you that chaplains have a legitimate place on a team. But when I take myself out of the chaplain role and I work with my crisis intervention peers, there's almost a hesitancy to bring a chaplain on board their team because they don't understand what chaplains do. They assume that they're there to proselytize. They're going to not follow the crisis intervention model because they're going to jump right into prayer, or they're going to do that sort of stuff. But the truth is that per Pew Research studies, 83% of the world's population believes in some form of spirituality. They consider themselves to be spiritual people in one faith or another. Right. And in the U.S., the same study, over 60% of the U.S. population will seek out trusted religious leaders or spiritual leaders in their faith when they're confronted with crisis. So when there's something in their life that happens that they can't understand or process. And so the truth is, the vast majority of people that we'll work with in crisis intervention want to engage in a spiritual conversation because they're spiritual before the really bad day, and then something comes to shake their faith. Absolutely. And they'll either lean into their faith or they'll start to question their faith. And without someone to talk through that's trained and equipped to do that, that's a part of their whole person that's left uncared for.
Absolutely.
And so crisis intervention trained chaplains have a legitimate place on a CISM team, and every CISM team should have access to one, just like every CISM team should have a clinical director that's a professional mental health counselor.
Absolutely.
They should have a chaplain available to meet with people who want to engage with that level of care. If they don't want to engage in that level of care, that's okay.
Absolutely.
They can just be a crisis interventionist on the team. Yeah. But at least the people that we're working with know there's someone they can reach out to if they want or need to engage in those spiritual conversations. And the great thing about that is you don't have to have a chaplain from every faith on your team.
That's right.
Because that chaplain is trained. If it's their faith, they can speak directly into it. If it's not, they can find tools that are universal across faiths, and they're trained to know where they can plug people in. That's right. If I work with someone who's not of my faith, I know where the local houses of worship are for their faith. I know who the moms and all the people that are in charge of other faith groups. I know where they are. I probably have met them, and I can walk them over to that level of care that's more specific for their belief system, because 83% of people in the world say faith or spirituality is part of their coping mechanisms. Yes. If you don't provide for that level of care on your CISM team, you're taking away or not making available a tool to help you reach 83% of the world population.
Wow.
That rely on that,
Yes.
those coping mechanisms that come from their faith and their belief in something that they can't logically understand.
Right.
Well, critical incidences are things that you can't logically understand.
Absolutely.
Faith is, if someone has faith, is going to be part of the solution.
That's right. Absolutely. That's very good. You know, in our teams, one of the things that we practically do is when we go in and we do an intervention with people is we have, there may be more than one chaplain on our team, but we only identify one.
True.
And the rest of us are there with the head of crisis interventionist. But we always let them know in the beginning, we have a chaplain here. So if you wish to speak with a chaplain afterwards, then they're going to be waiting right over here. And so please feel free to engage them if it's something that that you would like to be able to talk to them about. And which is really important because we're not pushing the chaplain on them, but we let them know that that chaplain is available and they are there waiting. And maybe that's the only thing they do on that team. And maybe no one engages them. Maybe they do, but it is available. And, maybe they're the one wearing the chaplain shirt or the chaplain jacket where the rest of us are wearing, the crisis intervention shirts, because that way they know, they identify this is the chaplain. And so they know they can engage that if they want to or if they don't. And I've seen time and time again where maybe people wouldn't have anything to do with us when we're working as the crisis interventionist, but they go straight to the chaplain as soon as the intervention is over. And that's the only person they would talk to. Right. And which is really neat because usually the chaplain's always on our team crisis intervention trained. Right. So they have the tools to be able to step into both places where they can approach crisis intervention spiritually, because that's what the person is seeking, and they're not necessarily seeking the intervention itself.
Yeah, so many times you hear the word chaplain, and what that really means is it's a local pastor who's just tagging along. That's not going to integrate well with the CISM team.
It's not.
Chaplains are trained very specifically to do the work of a chaplain. If you happen to be a pastor or a faith leader and a chaplain, it's like changing hats. You literally take one off and lay it aside and put the next one on. And chaplains are crisis intervention trained.
Absolutely.
They know the same process that the rest of the team knows.
Yes, so important.
I like your story with Elise because it highlights that that crisis intervention was important, but chaplaincy is what ultimately was the tool that was used to help her find freedom.
Yes.
And it's not always like that. Sometimes it's reversed.
That's right.
Sometimes people just need crisis intervention. In fact, a lot of the peer-reviewed studies say crisis intervention alone helped tremendously.
Yes.
Sometimes people just need a chaplain. What if it wasn't a single incident today, but it's connected with years of grief or trauma, or it attaches to something else, but they don't want to go see a counselor?
So often that's the case.
That's a chaplain. Chaplaincy is the tool in that circumstance that can help them.
Absolutely.
So they can be used one or the other, or both together. And together, I think they build a synergy and that they work well to be more powerful together than they are individually. But from a team perspective, having that option is very important.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Sometimes one is needed and sometimes other, but it's always, why would you bring your team in as only half of a team?
Yeah,
that is my question.
Would you leave out something that can be helpful to someone in the room when it's easy to add that component?
Absolutely. That is the big question. Just like a chaplain should always be crisis intervention trained. It is the tool. We talk a lot about in chaplaincy about tools, right? So when we show up, it's like a paramedic showing up on scene in an ambulance. What good would that paramedic be without his tools or his equipment? Without the medications and the equipment that you have to save lives, you may do some good, right? But really what you need is your tools and your tool bag. And so that is what crisis intervention is for a chaplain. And that is also what chaplaincy is for a crisis interventionist. Why would you show up on scene and to be a first responder? And I'm going to tell you, crisis intervention is a first responder role. And why would you show up without all of your tools?
Absolutely.
Why would you show up as a chaplain without all your tools for crisis response?
intervention team without all your tools with the chaplain.
You've got to be able to pair the two. I really feel like we do a disservice when we don't. It's like not having a counselor, or, somebody that you can lean on. Like with the story that I told with the paramedic, I needed to be able to refer her out. And I don't know what they talked about. I don't know what happened, but I know that it was part of the story that brought healing. And so we need all of our tools to be able to work together and to be able to bring complete healing, because as we talked about in the beginning of this episode, we're not just spiritual, we are not just physical, but we are a combination of all of those things. And so why would we only treat half of the body?
Absolutely.
Why would we only treat half of our personhood? So anyway, that is something that did you have anything else you wanted to add to this? This is a lot.
It's a lot of information.
It is a lot of information, but I just want you to know that after doing this for years, like I said, I couldn't see showing up on scene of any type of incident without having my chaplaincy and crisis intervention tools together. I think that one without the other is disservice to the people that you're trying to help. Yep. And I know that sounds kind of hard, but it's true. And we've worked with so many first responders, so many. And I'm telling you, probably half of them really were very interested in the chaplaincy side, and half of them were very interested in intervention. But the fact that we could pair the two together, they felt very well cared for.
Yeah, and in places that aren't first responder circles that we've done crisis intervention and chaplaincy in, it's almost a higher percentage of people that are interested in the chaplain side. So
yes, absolutely.
It works across all society.
Yes. Actually, being called in through crisis intervention, I know one particular story, we were called in to a church. And they would not have called us in as interventionists if they had not known that we were also chaplains.
True.
And so it actually will open the doors too for your team to be able to do different things and not just work with one type of people or people group, because they need to know that you can switch hats, like you said. And I know many pastors that are crisis intervention trained, and I know that's kind of going off topic, but they also become chaplains. Yeah. And I've seen so many pastors. One of the leaders here in I.F.O.C, actually two of the leaders here in I.F.O.C, they were pastors first, became chaplains, and then crisis interventionists, because they saw how much it helped their congregation.
If you could ask them what they'd rather do, they'd say crisis intervention between all the three.
Yes, they're amazing, though, I tell you what. And now they're even doing it within the church.
They are.
And they brought chaplaincy and crisis intervention within the walls of the church. And they've seen incredible results.
Yeah.
So they all marry very well together. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the next episode. And I just really want to encourage you to go back, if you have not seen episodes 1 and 2, to go back and watch what is a chaplain and then what is crisis intervention, because it really is, it builds the foundation of the things that we're talking about here. And I just want to encourage you to go back, but don't miss the next episode. Yes. Because we're going to have a special guest speaker on there as well, and it's going to be incredible as we conclude all this and bring it all together. Thank you so much for joining us.